after the 2018 World Championships, Nogami showed us this. A brand new main weapon added to the game called the Explosher, with a completely unique playstyle, being the first anchor weapon of sloshers, providing area of effect, unique slosher angles, and high paint output, which enabled many different styles of comps than we've seen before. And now, all this time later in Splatoon 3, the Wellstring's been added to the game, having pretty much the exact same set of strengths and weapon attributes as Explosher. But which one of these is actually better? With both of them trending upward, I think it would be fun to compare them and see which weapon is better in each category. If you enjoy this comparison and want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe or consider becoming a member to help support the channel. Let's get started. Now, before we go straight into the comparisons, let's talk about what these weapons are trying to do exactly, so we can get a basic idea of what we're trying to look for in these categories. These weapons are typically the anchor in their comps, meaning they are the longest range and most often the slowest weapon in their comps. They provide area of an effect, which is the ability to hit around corners or obstacles, both due to the unique arc that they have, but as well as the blast radius, or blast radiuses, of the Wellstring. These can not only be used to do high damage in one shot, but can also be used to chip damage reliably for other teammates, making these weapons more common with other options that can hit around corners, like sloshers, blasters, or even stuff like Dynamo Roller, for instance. In addition to that, the paint output they provide is also very nice for these weapons that aren't able to do as much. While these weapons don't have the range or direct control of open space that other backlines do, these are the traits that make up for it. In addition to that, both of these weapons have pretty interesting kits which also add to their toolkits, and we'll get to at the end of the comparisons. So, let's get started. First off, mobility. We got two pretty slow weapons here. Explosher has quite a bit of end lag and startup, and is mostly able to move by jumping and sloshing at the same time. It can slosh low to the ground if it needs a bit better mobility, or use the paint trail it provides in order to swim forward. Pretty weak mobility, all things considered. Wellstring, on the other hand, is a bit laggy after a charge, being about 15 frames of end lag, and while its tap shots are a little bit slow, it's still pretty quick to move if you need to, and its vertical shot provides a consistent paint trail you can swim in. Usually. Instead, this weapon's speed weakness comes from its charge time, being about a total of 80 frames long, meaning that especially if you want to attack at your maximum distance, there is a large delay to it. It's also worth noting that both of these weapons are heavyweight, having a bit of a speed penalty compared to normal options. At the end of the day, I'll give the mobility option to Wellstring. Not being tied to a huge amount of startup and end lag does give it options to move quicker, especially if it has the area around it covered, which it usually will. Next up, solo killing. Obviously these weapons are built to work with others primarily, but how well can they function on their own? If they need to get a key pick when no one's helping them or are getting rushed down, how good of a job can they do? For Wellstring, you're pretty much entirely dependent on your first ring charge. While it's incredibly difficult, if you're able to hit all 5 arrows, you can one-shot the opponent. And luckily, even if you miss, the explosions on the floor do enough damage to be able to one-shot if you hit at least 4 of them, meaning you can try to spam the area directly in front of you to keep people away. However, the explosion radius on this is pretty small. All bow explosions have the same blast radius as S-Blast's long-range mode, and since the explosions are closer together, you're not getting that wide area of effect that Wellstring usually gets, so it's a little bit difficult. Explosher, on the other hand, has a much easier 90 hit by hitting a direct, as well as hitting someone on the floor, which has the added benefit of painting over them, making the next shot a lot easier to hit. In fact, even if you don't hit a 90, just hitting anyone is going to slow them down, making follow-up shots easier. I think this gives Explosher a bigger consistency factor, and while Wellstring can kill faster in theory with its one-shot, being able to apply more damage more easily at a long range, as well as the ability to trap opponents, puts this clearly in Explosher's favor. Next up, assisting or area of effect. Which one is actually better at helping its teammates in kills? Wellstring has a big advantage right off the bat. When its arrows are spread out, it has a much wider hitbox. They will have to be a little bit more horizontal or vertical than the circular hitbox of Explosher, but it still covers a lot more distance. Meaning if you angle it correctly, this is going to be a bigger hitbox for you. However, Explo has an advantage here. While the bow explosions do only 30 damage, Explosher's AoE does 35, giving it a higher damage ability and easier ability to cover others. This is a really close category, because in theory, Wellstring's ability to spread out its shots and its 2 different firing modes gives it the ability to hit areas at a much wider space than Explo does, while Explosher has a little bit better damage and more consistency. While I really debated this category, I think Wellstring does win overall. If you're playing with teammates that have a lot of high damage options, 30 or 60 damage from 1 to 2 explosions is usually going to be enough, and the ability to have a faster rate of fire if you're a little bit closer to them means that you can have AoE spam that's a lot faster than Explosher. In other words, if you're not the one being shot at and you're helping a teammate, I think that Wellstring does a little bit more. Next up is its range and total paint output. These weapons' range value is pretty much the same, so there's not much there. The paint, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Wellstring typically paints by having its full charges, which spread out the arrows as much as possible, or tap shots if it's up close. It's worth noting if you're using partial charges, the paint is actually significantly diminished, meaning if you're going for higher damage, you're not going to be painting as much. Explosher, on the other hand, doesn't really have that sacrifice. Regardless of however you're sloshing, you're always going to paint the exact same amount. I find that Wellstring tends to get slightly higher painting numbers, especially if we're taking away the paint from either of Explo's kits, but Explo's ability to consistently do this while fighting, I think wins it this category. Next up, Ink Efficiency and Uptime. Yeah, this is a rough category for Explosher. With only 8 sloshes and a decent bit of white ink frames afterward, this is one of the most ink-hungry weapons in the game, as that was a big nerf it got back in Splatoon 2. Wellstring, on the other hand, has no white ink frames and 11 full charges. The lack of white ink frames is really what would secure this category, though. Being able to recover your ink tank instantly whenever you want gives you a lot more uptime in general, meaning you're going to be applying pressure more often than Explo does. Easy win for this weapon. Next up, DPS/object damage. Now, Explosher's not really that bad at this. It's pretty good against stuff like Bubble when it hits the top of it, but we're competing against Wellstring, the best object damage weapon in the entire game. This thing can tread walls, bubble, crab, you name it. Pretty much anything with HP gets melted by this weapon, especially if it's up close, but it's able to do a sizable amount of it at a distance as well, giving it a win in this category as well. Finally, let's get to the kits. We have 4 of these here, so I'm gonna go from worst to best. For sub-weapons, in last place would be Explosher's Point Sensor. Now, the reason I think Explo's Point Sensor is worse than Wellstring's is the white ink frames and ink efficiency issues that I talked about earlier. Because Explosher has such bad ink efficiency, it's much more dependent on using its special to refill its ink tank more quickly, and so having a sub that doesn't paint at all to get that special is a huge weakness for the weapon. While locating people with sensor is still useful, it's just not something Explo often has the time for. In third place is the auto bomb on the vanilla Wellstring. I think that auto bomb on it is fine. I mean, it's a bomb that can locate people, but it doesn't really help you too much when you're being rushed down or provide reliable chip damage that you can combo off of, meaning I think it has a lot less use cases with this weapon than you might think. In fact, I think its best use case is an insta-pop combo by throwing it upward and popping the Rainmaker shield. So I mean, it's a bomb, but it's not amazing. In second place is Splash Wall on Custom Explo. This has the problems I mentioned with Point Sensor, but the ability to stand in places that you normally wouldn't be able to against other longer range backlines gives it a really important use case. You still aren't often going to have the ink tank for it, but when you can use it, it's very helpful. And at number 1 is Point Sensor again on Custom Wellstring. Having a weapon with a lot more ink efficiency means you can use this very frequently, and Wellstring plays off the location very effectively. This means it's a sub that isn't going to take away from what the weapon is doing, unlike all other 3 options, while still providing consistent team utility to both you and the type of comps you want to play with. Next up, Special Weapon. In last place is Vanilla Explo once again with Inkstorm. Now, Inkstorm's alright on the weapon. A little bit of damage from the rain can allow the 90 to combo, and the extra paint helps out a bit. But Inkstorm isn't one of the strongest specials right now. It's hard to play off the healing factor, and the 8-second cooldown means it's going to eat into the time you can try to farm your next special. And since that's so important to this weapon, I think it ends up not working as well as it might seem. In third place is the Hammer on the Vanilla Wellstring. This can be really helpful in certain matchups, like against Tenebrella for instance, as well as give you an option to defend yourself if you need it. However, Stamp is a little inconsistent, and most of the time Wellstring isn't in positions where it's going to get a lot of value out of it. While you can throw the special to get your weapon back early, oftentimes this means you're not going to be using very much of the Stamp. Sometimes this has its use cases, again in Rainmaker where you can also damage the shield, it helps a lot, and it's not bad on the weapon by any means, but it doesn't really have as insane power as it might seem. The last 2 specials on on this list were really tricky to compete with. Explosher's triple splashdown is a quick ink tank refill that provides paint, the ability to keep people away far better than Hammer ever could, and allows the weapon to position much more aggressively. It's been a huge help in allowing Explo to play the way it needs to, and the explosions are something you can combo off quite easily on this weapon. However, Custom Wellstring has the best wave breaker by a mile out of any of them. Being able to use it as an ink tank refill and get quite a lot of them is one thing, but the location effect is also very useful. It allows you to see where enemies are, and if they get hit by wave breaker, it saves on some of the shots you need to kill, which is very useful for this weapon. However, most notably, there's an interesting combo between the wave breaker and point sensor. When you throw wave breaker, there's an additional quick location effect that marks for about 1.5 seconds. However, with this weapon, you can throw a sensor at anyone you see marked to tag them for much longer. In addition to that, the weapon's gear freedom means you can even run a little bit of special power up, which does have a sizable radius increase on it. I'd still end up giving this category to Custom Explo's Splashdown though. I think if that was put on Wellstring, while it would lose a bit of its location utility, which is a big part of that weapon, the ability to defend yourself more reliably or have better paint output would probably be more useful on it. Same for if Explo ended up having wave breaker on that kit. So at the end of the day, I think Custom Explo's Splashdown is better. Honestly, this is a very even comparison. The main kits of these weapons, being the Custom Explosher and Custom Wellstring, are both pretty even. I think Explosher provides a bit more consistent of a game plan. The chip damage and paint output is easier to follow up on, and the ability to trap people more easily with its paint is going to be something that its teammates like to play off of. And while Wellstring is a little bit less consistent, it provides a lot more utility. The object damage is great, especially with stuff like range or bucket that aren't great at shredding it, as well as the location effect for all this AoE to be able to easily hit people behind corners. While there's a lot of value to Explo's more self-sufficient playstyle, the prominence of both objects like wall and bubble, as well as good sharking weapons like rollers and decav, means the unique utility of Custom Wellstring finds more uses than Explo. However, I think both are in a solid spot right now. Thanks for watching, and let me know what comparisons you want to see next in the comments below.